For those who are logged in, we're just going to give it about 60 seconds for the room to fill up before we get started. Thank you. A very good evening to those in India and the East, good afternoon to Europe, and good morning to those waking up in the United States. My name is Rudra Chowdhury. I'm the director of Carnegie India. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming you to the 8th India in the World webinar. We at Carnegie India are committed to bring to you top-line analysis based on deep and collaborative research, especially in this time of a complex health emergency. The pandemic has deepened the fault lines across issues around globalization, international cooperation, global trade, the potential for factor market reforms, the future of work, the import of technology, the balance between privacy and contact tracing, the role of the international and the rise of the national. Yet, and what it has not done, is freeze the potential and reality of interstate conflict. In turn, and in at least one case, the present moment of geopolitical change appears to have emboldened state-led adventurism. Today's webinar is titled The Sino-Indian Border, Escalation and Disengagement. India shares a 3,488-kilometer long border with the People's Republic of China. The ongoing standoff between Indian and Chinese forces along the line of actual control, or the LAC, raises more questions than answers. The tragic, brutal, and unmilitary-like killing of 20 Indian soldiers and officers in the Galwan Valley has clearly led a reassessment of this 70-year-old relationship. The familiar diplomatic arc that defined this relationship will need to be redrawn. Between 1988 and 2013, the two countries entered into 5 landmark agreements designed in part to limit the potential for cross-border conflict. These will need to be reassessed. New SOPs will possibly need to be adopted. The potential of bullets being fired across the LAC is much higher today than it was only 2 months ago. There is much debate on whether or not India will pivot to different sets of alignments, including strengthening existing partnerships in the Indo-Pacific or escalating its investments in the Quad. Reportedly, the Indian government has passed orders ending the supply of Chinese parts and digital infrastructure in its state-owned telecom companies. It is less and less likely that companies, no matter from which part of the world, with proven ties to national governments and national militaries, will not be able to play a part in India's 5G future. In sum, the calamity in Galwan has rightly raised the question of the manner and method by which India and China can engage with each other. It has invited a much-needed debate on how India, including the government, the private sector, and the public at large, consider the costs of reducing dependence on China. In parallel, it has highlighted the importance of military readiness and the continued imperative of infrastructural development across a border that remains undefined and largely undemarcated. To examine these issues and fault lines, we are joined by 2 very special speakers, Ambassador Gautam Bambalwale and Ashley Tellis. Ambassador Bambalwale worked in the Indian Foreign Service for 34 years between 1984 and 2018. He has been India's ambassador to Bhutan, Pakistan, and perhaps most pertinently for this webinar, to China. And he has headed the Indian Cultural Center in Berlin. From 2004 to 2007, during the time of the India-US nuclear deal, he was a minister, political, and head of the political wing at the Embassy of India in Washington, where he played an important role in the transformation of India-US relations. He has worked at the Prime Minister's office and has 17 years of experience in dealing with China in various capacities. He is currently the convener of the Asia Economic Dialogue, supported by the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. He's a professor at the Symbiosis International University in Pune, Maharashtra, and a member of Carnegie India's Advisory Council. Ashley Tellis holds the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs, beg my pardon, and is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. He has for long specialized in international security and US foreign and defense policy, with a special focus on Asia and the Indian subcontinent. While on assignment to the US Department of State as senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, he was intimately involved in negotiating the civil nuclear agreement with India. I think it is fair to say that Ashley was the instrumental human actor in giving shape to the nuclear deal. Previously, he was commissioned into the Foreign Service and served as senior advisor to the ambassador at the US Embassy in New Delhi. He also served on the National Security Council staff as special assistant to President George W. Bush and senior director for strategic planning and Southwest Asia. Prior to his government service, Ashley was a senior analyst at the RAND Corporation and professor of policy analysis at the RAND Graduate School. Currently, Ashley serves as the Chief of Naval Operations Executive Panel in the United States. Before I turn to our guests, a couple of housekeeping points. We have over 700 people who've registered for this webinar from different parts of the world. Hence, voice questions are going to be very difficult. Could I please ask you to enter your questions if you're on Zoom in the Q&A icon at the bottom center of your devices. If you're joining us on YouTube, please add your questions in the comments box and it will relay to me in real time and I will bring them back to our panelists. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome our very special audience, including Kenneth Juster, the US Ambassador to India, Emmanuel Lenin, Ambassador of France to India, Mr. Sunil Mittal, a trustee at the Carnegie Endowment, and many others. I'm going to start with a few questions of my own for our two esteemed guests before we take questions from the audience. And first, perhaps I could turn to you, Ambassador Bambawale. So very recently, in the last 5 days, there's clearly been a lot of activity when it comes to India and China. A military commanders meeting concluded. Apparently, it was almost 10 hours long. Yesterday, the Russia, India, China trilateral completed. A couple of hours ago, Indian and Chinese diplomats discussed the border at the joint secretary level in India. Could I ask you to give us your view on the situation on the border as of now? Is the status quo ante, according to you, going to be returned in both Galwan as well as the Pangong Tso Lake?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rudra. And let me say, I'm delighted to be with all of you this evening on this very important subject. The situation on the border, as all of you can imagine, is tense. And this is not just in eastern Ladakh, but across the entire border between India and China. The LAC, as many of you know, is 3,488 kilometers long. And troops on both sides are at a fair level of readiness on both sides. Coming back to the question of the series of events which have occurred in the last few days, yes, I believe that there will be a slow but steady disengagement of forces, and there will be a drawdown in the force levels also. But I think this is going to take time. Let me also explain quickly, Rudra, that as far as the India-China border is concerned, there is no defined boundary, there's no agreed line of actual control. So what people like me and you need to go by is who was the first actor which made a change on the ground. And I think the answer to that is very clear to all of us. It was China. And therefore, China is responsible for the entire series of events which have occurred since then because of the change that they have made. And let me say that the bottom line for India is restoration of the status quo ante as it existed before all this started. And therefore, that is absolutely the bottom line for India. And we will wait determinedly for as long as it takes to restore the status quo ante. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Actually, if I can just turn to you, it seems at the moment that diplomacy seems to have taken over. There seems to be we're currently entering a period of diplomatic unease, but yet calm when it comes to disengagement. But at the same time, the critics argue that in the end, what may just happen is India cedes territory to China in areas that remain a misperception on the LAC, that more buffer zones get created, whether it's in Pangong Tso or whether it's in the Galwan Valley. How do you read the current disengagement and diplomatic efforts at play at the moment? Actually, I think you're on mute.
Let me thank you, Rudy, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here with Gautam, whom I've had the privilege of working with in the past. Let me say that it's desirable that a diplomatic process has begun. And let us hope that the diplomatic process reaches its final success. which, as Gautam pointed out, would be the full restoration of the status quo ante. But that is going to take time. And if it succeeds, I think it would be a very important landmark for India. Because what India will have shown is that it can resist Chinese efforts to change the status quo. And that is a very important signal for China. Let's think practically about what the Chinese were trying to do here. What the Chinese were trying to do was to occupy territory at relatively low cost to themselves and confront India with a fait accompli about the changes on the ground. If China succeeds, it would have been great from a Chinese point of view because they would have gotten more territory with very little cost. If India can now stay the diplomatic course and force China to retreat to the status quo ante, then I think that would be an enormous success with implications that go beyond just the Sino-Indian relationship.
So you don't see any potential for escalation in the immediate or the near future in these particular sectors, actually?
I see that as being less likely today, though it simply cannot be ruled out. And accidents can always happen when you have large numbers of forces in relatively close proximity to one another. But the reason for qualified optimism on the issue of escalation is that India has drawn a line. It has drawn a line very publicly and very visibly to China. And the onus is now on the Chinese to do more than they have done so far. And if China were to actually cross that threshold to sort of solidify control through the continued use of force, then I think it would be even more dangerous for China's reputation and for the issues of stability in the region.
Right. If I just move for a second from the immediate, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions on whether it's patrol point 14 or whether the amount of territory that may have been ceded or if particular areas are going to be converted to buffer zones. But before I do that, we've got a number of questions on that. But let me just move to a second segment, which is roughly along the lines of what you might call motivation. There are a number of theories in terms of why this happened. Some are geopolitical, some argue that there's a wider context to the tactical operational level interactions on the border. Many argue that it has to do with India's infrastructure build out. It has to do with Chinese assertiveness, not just in these sectors, but across the LAC as a whole. I just wondering, Gautam Bambal, from your perspective, what do you see as the main motivating factor for Chinese aggression at this particular point in time? I mean, the world is dealing with a pandemic. You would think that China would want somewhat stable relations with India. So what drives Chinese behavior at this point of time?
I have thought long and hard about this, Rudra, for over many weeks now. And I have basically come to the same conclusion that Ashley just mentioned, that it is as simple as Chinese troops wanting to hold territory and claim territory and control territory, which in their idea, in their mind, is theirs. At this point of time, they seem to be a little behind what they claim. And you have seen this play out in the last few weeks where they have even advanced now a claim to the Galwan Valley. So I think after factoring in many other explanations, I believe that it was this was the reason why they did it. And in fact, when you think about it, whether it was road building, have they been able to prevent India from building roads on our side of the LAC? The answer is no. People said that this is a warning to India not to get close to the United States and not to get close to the Quad. I think, in fact, the impact of the current crisis is going to go in the opposite direction, that India is going to strengthen its partnership with the United States and with the democracies of the world. So therefore, I believe that, for minor tactical gains on the ground, the Chinese have lost India strategically.
Actually, do you agree with that? I mean, there's a lot being said about, say, motivations. Gideon Rachman had an explosive piece in the Financial Times that did very well, at least within the Twitterati, in terms of, where he argued that these actions have essentially pushed India into the arms of the United States. But before we come to that question itself, I was just wondering what's the strategic payoff for China? Could it well be a case that there is a complete disconnect between tactical level actions and strategic decision making? Is this an issue of Chinese disconnectedness in civil military relations? I mean, how do you see this? I mean, how does China gain?
So let's go back to the fundamentals, right? The nature of this intrusion was not accidental or inadvertent. It was clearly calculated and prepared for, which meant that this was not a decision made by small units that routinely patrol the LAC. It was made at the very least at the theater level. And given what we know about Chinese command and control, if a decision is made at the theater level, it had to at least have, the acquiescence, if not the approval of people in Beijing. And the sheer scale of the intrusion suggests to me that there was a lot of pre-planning involved in this effort. So the question then becomes, why go to all this trouble? And I think there are two elements that have to be kept in mind here, and they provide the broader context beyond just the narrow question of territory. The first is there have been a series of accumulating Chinese grievances about India. They go back to what they see as India's cartographic aggression, after the Article 370 decisions and the transformation of Ladakh into the Union territory and so on and so forth. And in the last several months, I've been getting a earful from, the Chinese who have complained about India's efforts to change the status quo. I personally have said that this is obviously a misinterpretation of Indian decision-making, but nonetheless, that certainly seems to have been part of the element that sort of changed China's attitude. I think the second has to do with a broader strategic question of simply, reestablishing in their view what the pecking order in Asia ought to be. And the pecking order is that China is at the apex of the hierarchy, and India ought to know its place. And if you can kill two birds with one stone, which is get territory on the cheap, almost for free, on one hand, and force India to reconcile itself to, the new status quo, that would be an example of very successful intimidation, if not humiliation of India. And why wouldn't China come out ahead? I mean, if you look at it from Beijing's point of view, every past effort at salami slicing that they have engaged in East Asia, they have more or less come away with successfully. I think they gambled on the fact that India in these circumstances would find it too difficult to resist, much less force China to return to the status quo ante. And if India complied with those expectations, then that would be a great Chinese win.
Bambalwala, if I can just ask you, is this question of Kashmir and the decisions that were taken on the 5th of August 2019, do you see it as a primary driver of Chinese actions? I mean, there's some historical context here as well. If you remember in Arunachal Pradesh, sir, in the 1980s, a similar kind of activities took place, primarily when the state moved from a UT to a state. So is this part and parcel of those kind of context, or are we seeing something a lot more here? I mean, how causal, in a sense, was the Indian decision on Kashmir when it comes to the Sino-Indian relationship?
Look, I think there is a little bit of truth to what is being said, but I don't see a great linkage between the change which India has made, which is essentially internal to India. It is not impacting India's external frontiers. It's not changing India's external frontiers. And therefore, I would say that the probability of this being the cause is slightly less than others make it out to be.
Okay. And just if I can just stay with this one point, because it's been discussed to many lengths in the public domain, do you think that, this was internal to India, I think is a given and understood, but do you think that point was communicated to the Chinese? There was an acceptance within China from August 2019 till about May 2020 that this is indeed the case? It doesn't affect the border as we see it?
No, it was conveyed to China. That, you recollect, was our external affairs minister visited China and conveyed it to his counterpart there. Whether it was accepted is a different question. I'm afraid I won't be able to answer that because I think you'll have to ask the Chinese whether that is true. But I think the facts on the ground are that we're not changed the LAC as a result, or even our external boundaries as a result of this change in the domestic situation in the former state of Jammu and Kashmir.
Okay, if I can just take two questions from the audience now in the kind of segment of what's happening on the ground and motivations. There's a question from Kabilan, and there's a question from Amy Kasman of the Financial Times. The question is essentially around leverage. And they both ask is, what is the kind of leverage that India actually has to eject the Chinese from territory and actually genuinely on the ground return status quo ante of, say, 1 May 2020? So maybe I could just start with Ashley, because this is essentially what it comes down to. Is one is kind of diplomatic parley, coming up with various formulations, but the two is facts on the ground. So does India have what it takes to return the facts on the ground, Ashley?
I think that question has to be answered with reference to things that go beyond the facts on the ground, ironically. India's greatest leverage is that it can move in a radically different direction with respect to its relations with China. And that's really what Beijing needs to think about. Even if India chooses not to use military force to evict the Chinese, which I suspect is India's likely course, which is not to get into a conflict, to at least parry them, even if it can't push them back. But the leverage doesn't come from military action at this juncture. If military action had to be taken recourse to, it would have had to have been taken to much earlier. In fact, before the Chinese moved. So I don't think the solution is at the tactical operational level. The solution is really at the broader strategic level, which is, does China want a relationship with India which is marked by some degree of equilibrium? Or is China ready to accept the opening of a new front that will be far more hostile along its southwestern borders? And India has decisions to make on that score. And I hope we will get around to discussing that. But that, to my mind, is the true leverage. Now, if the Chinese sort of conclude that they've lost India irrevocably and it's not worth the effort, then, India moves in a certain direction. If the Chinese still want to establish a new set of understandings, then I think, their interests would be better served by at least returning to the status quo ante, because it does not subvert their claims on the territory anyway. I mean, that's the point I think that Gautam made, which needs to be emphasized, that even if there are buffer zones that are newly created, remember that would only be a formalization of buffer zones that always existed. There is always a gray area between the physical positions on both sides of their perceived line of actual control. And so there is no fundamental change in that sense. But if India, if India can use its strategic leverage in ways that make it difficult for China, that's something the Chinese need to think about.
Ambassador Bambalwadi, just to complete this segment, if I can just ask you, do you think that there is still, if I put it simply, a sense within China that we can still keep India on side? Or do you think there is a belief now that things have gone too far and it cannot be kept on side, which then has some effect on the way China deals, not just with India generally, but also especially with regards to a very long and contested border?
Yeah. I think till very recently, the answer to that question would have been, yes, China does think that it has the possibility of keeping India on side and not taking a very, very overt sort of position on the US-China relationship and US-China, trade and technology battle. But I think what has happened this summer is a game changer. And in fact, I am one of the people amongst many others in India who are advocating that this is an inflection point, and that India must make a reassessment of its policy, of its China policy, of its policy towards China, and not only make a reassessment, but also recalibrate its relationship with China. So I think, I think we will be moving in that direction. I do not think it can be business as usual.
So on the recalibration, if I can stay with that and move to another segment on economics between the two countries. Now, China is obviously a critical actor for India. We import about 14% of our imports came from China in the last financial year. If I can just ask you, Ambassador Gautam Bambalwadi first, do you genuinely believe that there is a recalibration on the Indian side when it comes to the economics between the two. More recently, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, the government of India has taken some pretty quick decisions when it comes to telecom. Whether they're confirmed or not, I don't know, but this is certainly what's reported. There generally seems to be there's a sense that whether it's goods and services, whether it's telecom, whether it's pharmacy, that there will be checks and balances. This, of course, came alive a couple of months ago with FDI rules, where a particular gate was placed on Chinese investments. Do you think these are knee-jerk reactions, or do you think that there is a general sense of taking a step back and strategically thinking about what the economic relationship may look like, and also accepting the costs of the decisions made?
Absolutely, Rudra. I agree with everything you have said. I do not think that there will be knee-jerk reactions. I think there will be a cool, calculated, calm, rational reassessment of the China policy, and accordingly we will recalibrate the policy itself. And you're absolutely right that the economics of the relationship is where we have some leverages and which could possibly impact the Chinese negatively. One example is, of course, we have discussed this, and I think you mentioned it in your initial remarks, to ensure that no Chinese firms can participate in India's trials on 5G and its eventual rollout. Also, there seems to be a lot of public anger, and I don't know whether this will last, and I don't know whether it can be over a longer period of time. But definitely, I think if that public anger can be utilized to ensure that without changing any rules, the purchases of at least some Chinese products can be reduced, and which would be a reduction which would impact some of these Chinese companies which are selling in India. So I definitely think that the economic leverage is something which will come into play, because that's where we do have some leverage over the Chinese.
Actually, if I can just ask you, public anger can cut in many different ways. Inspiration for today on a particular set of issues can turn on its head depending on the state of the economy down the line. China invests in India in a big way, whether it's in pharmaceuticals, whether it's in our automobile cluster, whether it's in infrastructure, for instance. I mean, it puts in about $8 or $10 billion into the startup space, from India's rival to Uber to payment apps. China has an investment. So clearly, on the Indian side, there's also a huge benefit of selective engagement with China. So how do you see this kind of pan out in the future? Because clearly the decisions we take today will have some consequences and costs down the line.
I think you have to think about it in two ways, right? Chinese investment in India is very important to India, because China is a great source of capital that oftentimes is in scarce supply. But you have to reverse the gaze and ask, how much is Chinese investment in India important to China relative to its dependence on other global markets? And I think when one looks at it from that perspective, Chinese investments in India, I would suggest, might be less important to Beijing compared to its dependencies in East Asia, Western Europe, and the American hemisphere. Having said that, though, there's no question that India enjoys economic leverage. And to my mind, the strategy going forward has to be exactly what you pointed out, which is it has to be selective engagement. That is, there will be issue areas in the economic space where Chinese investment should be welcomed because there is no national security consequence to it. But there are other areas where that is not true. And I think India needs to be less shy about clearly indicating which areas will be off limits because of national security considerations. And I think the telecom area is one. Broader questions of infrastructure, digital infrastructure, I think have to be revisited, because it's not simply the question of Chinese investments. It's also a question of access that the Chinese will have to Indian data and so on and so forth. India seems to be very perturbed about the West enjoying asymmetrical access. I mean, would it be comfortable with China enjoying asymmetrical access? So these are all issues that I think will come up for discussion and should.
Actually, sitting in the United States today, where clearly the domestic campaign has now kind of really taken off, and I was just wondering, on the economic part, there's been some argument with regards to the United States and the role the US can play at this point of time. So can it exploit or explore the current kind of break in Sino-Indian relationships? So as I go back to the Gideon Rachman kind of genre of arguments, is this really a time to close in or strengthen or do more in the US with the relationship with the US? Is that even possible given the fact that the US-India relationship taken on balance remains pretty strong? And are there economic advantages to be gained by both sides at this time, keeping in mind that US-India has its own pretty tricky trade relationship? I mean, it's something that you've spoken of at Carnegie and several places. When I remember when you were down in February, for instance, a lot of those discussions were on the back of the Trump visit and on the very hard economic negotiations from pharma to dairy. So it's one thing to say that the current crisis will push India into the American quarter, but is the American quarter as welcoming as it was, say, many years ago?
I don't think the US has been shy about declaring privately and publicly that we would value a much deeper and a much closer relationship with India. I mean, we've been saying this now for 20 years. And to my pleasant surprise, the Trump administration has actually doubled down on that message, right? Despite all the anxieties we have about allies and burden sharing and so on and so forth, where India is concerned, we have really given it pride of place in our strategy and in our strategy documents. I think sometimes almost to India's embarrassment that it's singled out as a pivotal player for the US. So I don't see any hesitation at the US side. But I think we are cognizant of India's environment, its circumstances, and its calculations. And so on this issue, we have actually deferred largely to India. We have allowed India to set the pace for the intensity of the relationship that it seeks. So you're not going to find hesitation in Washington if India wants to move farther and faster. But these are choices for New Delhi to make. And we recognize that China lives next door. India has a complicated relationship with China. And I think we seek that India would be a little less subtle in the way that it approaches us and engages us. We would like a more sort of forthcoming approach. But really, as I said, we will continue to leave the initiative with India on this issue.
Ambassador Bamlal, if I can just ask you on the question of initiative, there is one, of course, a set of choices that India will need to make in the near future if it indeed does want to recalibrate the relationship with China. And those will be pretty hard choices, which will have consequences. But clearly, in the economic area, whether it's geoeconomics or whether it's domestic politics, India as an attractive frontier for investment can only remain frontier if it gets its own economic house in order, which means large-scale factor market reforms, which means being able to remove some of those caps on foreign investments, making capital easier to flow. Do you see a connection between what would ordinarily be considered as domestic economic issues with the view to be able to exercise now external choices for India?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Rudra. I don't know the answer to that. But what I would like to say is that you're absolutely right. This is an integral whole. And India will have to make those choices. There will be painful choices. There'll be difficult choices. But I do hope that we are able to make them and go down the road that you have just described, as well as what Ashley just said, and he's absolutely right. Ever since, over the last 20 years, the United States has let India set the pace for the India-US relationship. And I do think that this reassessment and recalibration vis-a-vis our China policy is going to see a quicker movement on the India-US relationship, a stronger partnership between India and the United States, and with other countries and other democracies across the globe like Japan, Australia, and possibly even Indonesia, for example. So I do see this coming. I hope it happens quickly and happens fast. And I hope it happens integrally with changes required domestically in India.
So actually, if I can just ask you to unpack that for us for a little bit. So what does it actually mean when we say that India will move now closer to the United States or to perhaps particular alignments such as the Indo-Pacific? It could be the Quad. Now, India's just been elected a non-permanent member of the UNSC. It takes over the presidency of the G20 in about a year and a half. Can these positions multilaterally be leveraged? Is there more to be done? Do you see a shift towards Indo-Pacific in a sharper way because of this crisis?
So let me come back to the point that actually Gautam left with, because I think that's something that really needs to be appreciated. The economic reform and the continued economic reform in India is absolutely vital, even for the success of the US-India relationship. Because first, a weak India is a less attractive India for the United States. So India needs to be strong on its own terms, because unless India is strong in its own terms, the balancing behavior that we need to sort of put in place vis-a-vis China will simply not succeed, right? So India needs to sort of work that economic question really apart from whatever it does in the diplomatic space. And that economic question will have to include big issues about Indian economic openness to the outside world, including rethinking its relationship with trade and trade with the United States in particular, but trade with other countries also more generally. So that's point number one. It is the economy stupid. That is the foundation on which all the other efforts work. Second, there are things that India can do, and they don't have to be done with a in-your-face quality. There are many things that we can do subtly in terms of deepening diplomatic consultations, greater transparency in terms of sharing our visions of what the China challenge is, increasing interoperability between the countries of the region, both the democratic partners and even India with countries that may not be US allies. And of course, then the sort of cherry on the, that sort of gilds the cake is really the question of what India does publicly, whether it does it in terms of more visible engagement with the Quad, more activities in the UNSC, and so on and so forth. But I would like to see much greater movement in the activities that are sort of under wraps, as it were, because there are things that we can do with respect to military coordination, increased interoperability that don't have to be announced and don't have to gain attention.
Thanks, Ashley. So, Ambassador Babulwala, if I can just bring it back to questions around the need for military partnerships, interoperability. Where does Russia fit into all this? And I'm mindful of the fact that the Indian Defense Minister, I think, is still in Moscow. The RIC just completed. And you've got a set of questions from John Gill, from Anirudh S. and Ambassador Suresh Goyal on exactly that. What are the alternative centers of power for India? So one is, of course, the United States, but the United States has its own kind of issues with India. India needs to be more attractive to the US when it comes to the economy in itself, but there's a tried and tested partner in Russia. So where does Russia fit into the immediate issue? If you can tell us a little bit from your vantage point of the role it perhaps played in the immediate disengagement crisis, if anything at all, and in the larger future of India and Russia. So I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Yes, I hope you can hear me. You're absolutely right. This is a very good question, a very difficult question, because Russia, the former Soviet Union, and then Russia has been a very strong partner for India over the decades. And I think India will be loath to cast this kind of partnership aside. We will continue to work with Russia, as you can see even in the last few days. That particular relationship is very, very important to us, including the military aspects of it. So I think this is going to be something that India will have to walk a fine line between how it moves ahead in technology and military cooperation with the United States on the one hand and with Russia on the other. It's going to be a difficult walk, but it's going to be a difficult balancing act. But I think it can be done, and I think Indian diplomacy is up to this task. So we'll have to see how it moves ahead, Rudra.
So actually, if I can just stick with that for a second, how does that actually work with the United States? Because as much as India is moving away from a particular set of choices with China, it seems to be now moving to what we traditionally call more multipolarity, trying to find balance between many different power centers. So how does that work when it comes to your questions and issues around the US and the arguments that have been made in the press that this is going to lead to some kind of a break and India is now going to find itself more invested in the US? You have a US president who may well come back in November of this year, who's highly transactional, how is he going to read India's kind of more expanded pivot, albeit away from China, but not necessarily into the US?
Rudra, I'm sorry. I'm sorry,
No, go
Ashley.
ahead,
That's for
Gautam.
you.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
That's for you, Ashley. I'm sorry.
I actually wanted to comment first on the Russia question. I think one needs to appreciate the predicament that India faces in its relationship with Russia. And I think we appreciate that quite clearly. But there are two things that sort of occur to me that need to be kept into account. Today, more and more, the Russians are not willing to transparently side with India when it comes to Sino-Indian disputes. And that is something that India obviously has to factor into its calculus. India depends on Russia for all the reasons that Ambassador Bambawale laid out, which have to do very much to do with energy and arms issues. And so India can't walk away with Russia. But Russia's ability to sort of lean on China in order to help India, I think, is highly limited. There is a second problem which I think has not been appreciated, and that is nothing to do with politics. It has to do with technology. We are moving away from a platform-centric concept of warfare to a network-centric concept of warfare. That is an autonomous transition that is taking place outside of politics. Now, India's diversification of its platforms from many suppliers is actually reaching the point where it is causing India operational problems, where India, in order to satisfy the political requirements of various suppliers, is denying itself the operational benefits of greater integration, because each of the suppliers have anxieties about the other. So the US has anxieties about Russian equipment, the Russians have anxieties about US equipment, et cetera, et cetera. India splits the difference for now. And it basically says, no, we will continue to buy for political reasons equipment from different places, but we will not seamlessly integrate. In other words, India is denying itself the benefits of network centricity in order to advance certain political interests. And to my mind, at some point, India has to be aware that this strategy has costs. It has operational costs. And India will have to figure out how it can circumvent these operational costs, and these are not going to be easy, right? And the whole S-400 CATSA sanctions issue with the US is really in microcosm the essence of this problem, which is we do not want to sell India technologies that would be integrated with another supplier, which would then cause a compromise in our capabilities. And India basically says, we'll solve that problem for you at the cost of making it more difficult for ourselves. And I don't know how long this strategy can actually persist, not because of the politics, but because the technology has moved in an entirely different direction, which encumbers these political choices in ways that it didn't before.
Ambassador Bambawale, you had a point, but if I could just ask, is what Ashley describes as the difficult situation that India finds itself in, at least from an American perspective. In another way to look at it is what Tanvi Madan at Brookings would call India's continued hypnosis with diversification, always making sure that you have a hedge, always making sure that you have an option, even if the military readiness costs are pretty high. And here I think it's pretty clear that as the world moves to a very different form of warfare, that kit is available in the US, but the political leverage and the need for choice remains with India's investments in Russia. Do you agree with that kind of formulation? And do you see this continuing as India's move to the future? And I ask this also for one particular reason. Recently, there are reports that the Chinese have now invested themselves much more in Russia's digital frontiers, whether it's on 5G and other critical infrastructures, which is, I'm guessing, going to become yet another issue if India now wants to buy kit from both Russia as well as the United States. So just to stick at that strategic level, how do you see this knot in a sense? Again, you're on mute, sir. So.
Sorry about that. Sorry, I was on mute. But I started by wanting to make the point that your listeners and your viewers and you yourself, and I'm sure Ashley noticed very significantly that I have steered away from using the word ally or alliance. And we've spoken about partnerships, strengthening the partnership, etc. Unfortunately, the diversification of our weapon systems, etc., is something which is very deeply ingrained, and I think which is going to continue in the coming years. But I think one way to get over that is to increasingly make in India, which is something that we have been wanting to do and hoping to do. Um, I think the private sector is increasingly being brought into this whole game, and there have been some changes recently announced by our finance minister and by the government of India. So over the longer period, over the medium term, I think one of the options will to make some of these things in India. But yes, I think what Ashley mentioned is a fact on the ground about the technology aspects of systems. So it's going to be a difficult choice. But I think India will have to make these difficult choices in the weeks and months and years ahead.
Thank you. And now I'm going to just open up with a number of other questions. We've got 150 questions. So I'm going to do my best in about 25 minutes to steer this. But to stay with the theme on kind of the geopolitics of the China issue, there's a question from Rajesh Rajagopalan. And it's an interesting one. It is to say is that how do other Indo-Pacific countries view the situation with China? Apart from India and apart from, say, the United States, have the other partners to the Indo-Pacific been able to coalesce, been able to come together when it comes to this particular issue? Ashley, perhaps? Ashley, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. I think there has been a clear shift in regional attitudes towards China, at least since Xi Jinping took power. My own view is that Chinese attitudes began to change. Chinese attitudes towards the region and the world began to change much earlier. But certainly, since Xi Jinping ascended to office, regional attitudes have become much more suspicious and careful. So there are two or three things that are happening simultaneously. One, under the Trump administration, the US has begun to look very transparently at China as a competitor. Now, this puts certain burdens on regional players. There's no question, because they feel like they're often forced to choose sides. And whether that's our intention or not, people storm when they are forced to choose sides because of the realities of their continuing economic dependence on China, or at least interdependence with China. But the fact that the US has changed course is really significant. Two, the alliance partners, when I think particularly of Japan and Australia, have become much more forthright on the need to deal with the Chinese challenge and are deepening their security ties with the US in response to that challenge. The other countries that are caught in the middle, I think the shifts are more subtle. But there is no question in my mind that the direction is going towards greater balancing of China, rather than simply the traditional hope that interdependence and China's good behavior would sort of protect the security of all the players in the Indo-Pacific.
And there indeed, I mean, if you look at the positions taken by the Morrison government in Australia, it seems quite striking. There's a big difference between the last government in Australia and this present one, who don't seem to be hesitant about anything but hesitant, in fact, about their positions. There was a virtual summit, as you know, between the two countries. So do you see more of that? Do you see that is the flavor of the near future, that there's a basic acceptance now that we have to deal with this problem, and it is a problem?
Absolutely. I think it is China's greater aggressiveness over the last few months or years, if you want to put it that way, which is forcing countries across the Indo-Pacific to take a harder look and be more frank, forthright about their relationships with China. And I think that is something which is happening all over. And I think India is also going to be one of those countries which is going to, make a course correction as far as its China relationship is concerned. And in that sense, expanding our partnerships with all major democracies in this part of the globe is a very, very important aspect of the recalibrated and renewed relationship.
Mr. Babalwale, I've got a bunch of questions, but perhaps best represented by DK Jain and Deep Pal. And it's taking us back to the LSE in itself. Now, between 93 and 2013, there were several agreements, exchange of notes. If I'm not mistaken, in 2012, Ambassador Shiv Menon exchanged notes with IPing just to make sure that both sides put their signatures on the latest developments in the Sino-Indian relationship. And to a large extent, that framework kind of worked. It was an uneasy framework. There were clashes on the border, 2012, 13, 14. But that framework generally worked. Are we at the LAC level? Do you see a new framework coming about? I was just doing the readout from the MEA meetings today, and it certainly seemed that what they're working towards is another working committee, a boundary committee, building out confidence building measures. So at the one hand, I take your point that India is considering a recalibration of the relationship. But on the other hand, from what we can make out, and it's very early from the discussions taking place, is going back to the same arguments on confidence building, working boundaries. It certainly doesn't seem to be a reimagination of the LAC or the fact that China's clearly reimagined the LAC in itself.
This is a very important and interesting question, Rudra. And all the people who have raised this question are absolutely right. That you see, both countries had realized that when you don't have an agreed boundary and you don't have an agreed LAC, then you need to maintain peace and tranquility in the border areas. And this whole set of, there's a whole architecture which was built in these various agreements from 1993 all the way to 2013, which built up this architecture for maintaining peace and tranquility on the boundary. My view is, unfortunately, by the move that the Chinese have made this time, much of this architecture is now broken. It has fallen by the wayside, and definitely there will have to be a new kind of architecture, if you want to use that word, which will need to be built up on the LAC, on the boundary, in the border areas between India and China for maintenance of peace and tranquility. For the simple reason that I don't think LAC clarification or a boundary resolution is going to be that quick or that fast. That would have been ideal. But in the absence of that, you have to maintain peace and tranquility, because the relationship as a whole cannot, be moved on, and you cannot work on the rest of the relationship till you have peace in the border areas. So I think the existing, architecture is broken. There might be elements from the existing architecture which could be included in a new architecture, but it's absolutely essential to build a new architecture, and which will be adhered to by both sides.
So if I can just push you on that and perhaps ask you a slightly uncomfortable question, there is an SR process. There's a special representative process between the two countries. If I'm not mistaken, both countries have talked the border now in 22 rounds, not gone too far perhaps. Has the time for the SR process come to a pass? Do we need to now reimagine the formal process by which a border negotiation, if at all down the line, is considered?
Yeah. Look, Rudra, I was an integral part of the SR process, so I'm the wrong person to be called, ask this question. I was not the SR itself, as many of you know, but I was an integral part of the SR's process over many, many years. I don't disagree with, the point you're making that, we are at the most difficult part of resolution of the boundary. It's the give and take part. And to be frank, yes, we are far away from a resolution. But I don't know if, there can be some other process which will be able to resolve the boundary and get a solution to the boundary quicker than the current process. All of you know the history of so many different processes. The current process is at a fairly high level, at a political level. And therefore, I think we must give it a chance, but it can also be reorganized and recalibrated, if you want to use that word, to a certain extent. But I myself do not think that boundary resolution or even LAC clarification is going to happen quickly. And therefore, the maintenance of peace and tranquility becomes very, very important. And the current, tenets, the current principles, the current operating procedures, I believe have fallen by the wayside. We'll need new ones soon.
Actually, if I can just turn to you, you're someone who studied China for a really long time. Do you think, in your view, at some level, the leadership inside of China was slightly taken aback by the overall reaction to what might have been considered as a local boundary issue, whether it was organized or not? Or do you think this was in some ways an expected reaction in itself? So how do you read? And the main reason I ask this is because there was an unusual way of dealing with China in the last 3 to 4 years, perhaps a productive way, but it was leader-led. It was not, the focus was not so much, as at least from the outside we could make out, on the SR process or the formal boundary protocols, but it was a leader-less process between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. So at some level, that many argue that that equation has not really paid off. Now, in a sense, there's no direct causality between those high-level discussions and the bottom. But how would you think the Chinese read the reaction to what happened in those testy days of June?
Well, if the Chinese were surprised, then that testifies to an extremely high degree of Chinese solipsism. Because just as the Chinese are very exercised about territorial matters, so is the government of India. I mean, both sides have very strong views about territory. Both sides cannot be seen to be publicly humiliated through forced expropriation of territory. And so if the Chinese were surprised, then they have only themselves to blame, right? But I wouldn't throw this at the feet of the leaders themselves in the way that you were suggesting, because my own view, at least reading India's calculations, was that the efforts that Modi made were really efforts at trying to convey to the Chinese that India does not have a basic antagonism towards China. And that so long as a framework could be derived to manage disagreements, that framework would actually serve both countries well. I think that was the essence of Modi's effort with Xi. I don't think Indian illusions about China ever disappeared. But I think Modi's view was the process has taken us so far. I need to sort of double down and make certain that I can neutralize the Chinese threat in order to be able to proceed with my domestic agenda of economic development, growth, peace on the frontiers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, whether the prime minister, reconsiders the investments he's made, only time will tell. But it was not an irrational strategy for Prime Minister Modi to at least try in an effort to sort of keep the peace and sort of solidify the equilibrium that had been reached after all these decades of multiple agreements.
Actually, how do you see if India does indeed close out technological cooperation with China, let's say when it comes to 5G networks, which is clearly India is a massive market for 5G. It's not a small cost to China, for instance. There is some, you may read it as leverage on the part of India. But if India basically closes the drawbridge and says no 5G network for any Chinese company, what do you think the cost of those actions will be?
I think the Chinese would understand that in some peculiar way because, they are arch realists. The Chinese have no illusions about what India really thinks about China. And India would not be doing this alone. Now, there are many other Western nations that have been very skeptical about Chinese participation in 5G. And to the degree that this can actually be done in a coordinated fashion with other Western partners, I think India's leverage only increases. See, unfortunately, unlike 4G, where you can segregate parts of the network, between hardware and software, core and periphery, and so on and so forth, you don't have that luxury in 5G networks. So it really becomes a much bigger gamble. And I think India has to sort of bite the bullet in this one and just protect its own interests.
And Ambassador Bamalwal, if I can just stick with this point, not just on telecom and 5G, but you're someone who's intimately connected to India's startup space, whether it's apps or new investments, for instance. The fact is, if we move to a more calibrated relationship with China and we make those choices, we reduce the dependence on China when it comes to capital into the VC space or the startup space, and a much larger question of strategic critical infrastructure such as 5G. How do you see that playing out with Chinese counterparts? And who's going to fill the vacuum? In the end, if money's not coming from Alibaba or Tencent, there has to be money coming from either Japan or the United States. At this point of time, the capital certainly doesn't seem to be in India.
No, I'll attempt to answer that question, Rudra, at a more general level. And that general level is this, that look, some of these economic decisions will indeed cause pain in India. And many people in India have also been arguing with this and arguing on these grounds and like this. But the fact is that if you want to recalibrate your China policy, you will just have to deal with this kind of pain. And I think there is determination in India to do that at this moment in time, not only at the political level, not only at the governmental level, but even at the people's level. So there is a lot of public support for policies which will punish China, and where India will also feel some of the economic pain, but we'll just have to bear with it. That's part and parcel of what we will have to do.
Rudy, let me add two other thoughts to that. I agree with Gautam completely on this question, but it's mistaken view to think that there is a capital shortage in the world, right? If anything, it's the opposite. I mean, we have a massive glut of savings that is having difficulty finding productive investments. So the question really is twofold. One is, why are the savings that are circulating in the international economic system not reaching India when there might be profitable alternatives? And I would say there are two things that India needs to look at. One is information deficits. So India needs to do a much better job of sort of selling itself to the world in order to attract that capital. And two, there are questions about Indian policies. And again, this takes us into territory where, conversations become uncomfortable. But I mean, the lack of predictability in a lot of Indian policymaking is, to my mind, the single biggest deterrent to getting foreign capital to come and invest in India. Because if you cannot have assurance of the safety of your investments, if you cannot have assurance about protecting your IP, and so on and so forth, I mean, there's a long list of arguments you can imagine here. People will not come. And so I think India has to do a lot of that work at home to sort of change the operating environment. But I would not simply make the argument that there is a shortage of capital and therefore India has no choice but to rely on Chinese capital. No, there's plenty of capital around there. The real question is, what must India do to attract that capital from outside China?
So, Ambassador Bamalwal, if I can ask you a question which might be a little outside of your kind of thing, is actually makes an important point. The capital is there. Clearly, India has to be attractive in order for that capital to flow in. Do you think that this is a genuine, so the pandemic opened up, one would say, an opportunity for India to reimagine its economics. Many argue that this is the time for serious second generation structural reforms in land, labor, capital. The government did some of that through ordinance when it came to labor, but it's certainly not far enough. Now, given there's a double whammy of the China crisis on top of the pandemic, on top of what was already a structural economic crisis in India, so you're kind of dealing with a three-tier crisis system. Do you think finally there is a sense in government from the people you interact with, you speak to, your former colleagues perhaps, that it is now genuinely a time to make sure that India is a safe bet when it comes to investments, that there'll be a predictable regulatory framework? And I know for the fact that I don't know if Ambassador Justice is still on this call, but I know that the US Embassy, for instance, has struggled with this question of regulation when it comes to e-commerce. Many others from Japan have struggled with this question when it comes to investing in India's vibrant startup industry. But do you think that the lightning has actually struck and the government is now ready to make those hard calls on domestic economics?
Yeah, I tend to agree with the point you've made, Rudra, that the lightning has struck. And the reason for that is not so much external. It is a wee bit external on the basis of what we've just argued, but it is also domestic, that the Indian economy has shown a secular downtrend in GDP growth over the last few years. And it is quite obvious to even ordinary people like me who are not economists, that second generation reforms are absolutely essential. The only point that I would like to add here is that, all of you know India and you have seen India, many of you have visited and lived in India. Don't expect some quick sort of reform. It will be slow, steady. It will be like testing the water before you get in. So there will be a kind of slow movement forward. It's not going to be instantaneous, or it's not going to be quick. So I think this is the direction India will take and will have to take in order to to have a resurgent GDP growth rate as far as the economy is concerned.
Okay, we've got a slightly offbeat question, but I'll ask it because there are about 5 people who've asked this. It's from Aniruddha Datta and Ambika Vishwanathan, which is on the role of the EU in the current Sino-Indian crises. And I think the question that they're essentially asking is, India's put a lot of effort into engagement with the European Union, whether it's on investments or data, energy, renewables, and now the tricky area of what the EU calls the Green Deal, for instance. But the EU took a fairly neutral position, at least publicly. It was predictably neutral. Half the EU is well engaged in the Chinese BRI, which perhaps kind of limits their ability to take a position, a stronger position when it comes to the Sino-Indian issue or anything to do with China, for instance. So if I can just start with Ashley and perhaps with then Ambassador Gautam Bhamalwale, where do you see the EU fitting into this puzzle? Clearly, it's a very different kind of actor than the one sitting around the Indo-Pacific table. But at some level, the EU now seems to be developing its own diversification strategy, which is pegged on Chinese finance, which is it's perhaps more non-aligned today than India might have even been in the 1980s when it comes to China. So how does that work out?
Well, this is a good example of the complexity of dealing with China, right? I don't think there are any illusions in the EU about China as a predatory actor on many counts, including in the economic. But despite that recognition, everyone is looking for productive avenues of engagement. And the fact that the EU has not said anything on the China-India crisis, to my mind, is not at all surprising. I would be shocked, in fact, if they did, right? The question really is, can you find ways of engaging the Chinese productively while still protecting your core interests? And I think that is what the EU is struggling with right now. And you can see the decisions and the discussions that are taking place within the union about, what areas should be keep out areas. How should one entertain Chinese interests beyond the current projects that are BRI related? What space does that one make for China in the technology areas, and so on and so forth? So we are not at the end of this question, we're just at the beginning. But I would say don't have high expectations of the EU in the areas of high politics. India should continue to engage with the EU in areas of low politics because it's a win-win situation. But India should be focusing more on European national capitals when it comes to issues of high politics. That's where the action is.
If I can just turn to Ambassador Bhamalwale, there's the EU and then there's France. And I don't know if the French ambassador is still on the call, but how do you see this kind of going ahead? Because the way some would see it is France obviously is critical not only to the economic relationship, but more so perhaps to the defense relationship. Do you see this as a problem? Do you see kind of should India just rely on what would essentially be a predictable EU set of answers given its own position? Or do you think that this might actually push India to in turn shove the EU in a different direction and say, look, maybe it's time for you guys to make a choice as well?
Look, as far as the current crisis on the India-China border is concerned, I think many of us in India understand that the EU at this point in time had its hands full with combating the COVID-19 situation in each of their respective and individual countries. So, we understand this. But in the medium and long term, I think the relationship definitely with the major EU countries, and you mentioned France as an example, which is a great partner for us, a very strong partner for us. I think it's only going to expand, it's going to become stronger. And of course, we do need to engage economically with the EU as a whole. I think that is integral and important to strengthening the partnership with the entire European Union.
Thank you. And I've just seen that Ambassador Justin is indeed on the call. And if I may just quote, he says, I'm still on the line, very much enjoying the excellent conversation. And Ashley is correct that there is plenty of capital available globally. And then India needs to increase its regulatory certainty, among other things, to make itself a more attractive environment for foreign investment. So I just thought I'd just put that out there. And as someone in India, and perhaps sitting on the other side of the table, not representative of the government's view, but on analysis, one would also hope that then, I suppose, that things become easier on the economic front. And perhaps this is also an opportunity to relook at the US-India trade differences and problems from a very different perspective and go back to some of the strategic rationale that drove the relationship in the first place, which Ashley was instrumental in designing. And I know Ambassador Gautam Bambalwale played a key role when he was in DC and otherwise. But we're coming to the close of the webinar. And if I can just end perhaps with, there's a question from Sarah Hasselberth, again, from the EU, from Germany. And Sarah asked an interesting question is, and perhaps if I can, my last question to Gautam Bambalwale is, if we were to look at the crises today, if you had to fast forward yourself 5 or 10 years, would you actually, and this is of course a counterfactual question, but would you see this as a critical juncture in the Sino-Indian relationship, much like, say, the events of, say, 1986, which then changed the way the relationship was designed to the positive? And is this going to change it to the negative?
Absolutely. As I said earlier, I think this is an inflection point. And the reason it is an inflection point is because of the deaths of scores of Indian and Chinese soldiers on the border, which is something which hasn't happened for 45 years, as all of you know. It also shows that the elaborate architecture that we have put into place has broken down. And I would say this is an inflection point for India, and India will definitely reassess and, as I said earlier, recalibrate its China policy. So yes, the answer to your question is simply put, yes.
And actually, if I can just ask you, is in the more immediate, how worried are you about the contacts on the border, the opportunity for escalation, given the levels of aggression, given clearly the levels of misunderstanding, the immediate diplomatic bridge notwithstanding? How worried about you with what essentially might be, as you said earlier on this webinar, a new frontier in China's national politics?
I'm more worried about accidents than I am about deliberate escalation at this point, because I think the Chinese have started to digest the reality that India is not going to acquiesce to their fait accompli. And I think that is a good thing, because even China at this juncture is not looking for an escalation of the conflict. They have enough problems of their own. So the real test was whether India would acquiesce or India would resist. I think India has sort of clearly identified what its view on that question is. It is going to resist. And I don't think the Chinese are going to now push forward with further escalation on this question. But I think, your viewers and readers ought to know that the buildup on both sides in Eastern Ladakh and elsewhere is extremely large. It is not just a buildup at the brigade level. There is a buildup both at the frontier and movement in depth. So accidents can occur, and that's what we really want to avoid at this point. We want to avoid inadvertent events that could provoke things that neither side intended. I think in a political sense, India has signaled that it is simply not going to roll over and play dead. And I think that is an extremely important signal for India to send, not only for itself, but also for all the other countries in the Indo-Pacific that are watching whether China can sort of salami slice on land and get away with it.
Okay. And I think with a couple of minutes left, and this is perhaps the best part of the program, if I can ask each of the guests, do you have a question for each other? I know Gautam Bambalwale might have a question for Ashley.
Yeah, Ashley, I have a question which has been touched upon in our conversation over the last 1.5 hours. But it's very important for people in India, especially decision makers, to know this, the answer to this. that, I argued that Chinese action on the border has actually helped India to decide to strengthen its partnership unambiguously and significantly with the United States. I hope there will be reciprocity from the US, and I hope that you will not now turn towards China and try to think of a G2 or something of that sort. We need some indications on this front.
And if I can just add to that, Ashley, for 1 second, is on Ambassador Bambalwale's question is, one is to answer the question, perhaps keeping the current administration in mind, but also perhaps if you could give us some thoughts on what happens if the administration changes in November.
So this is a very good question, and it's one that I'm sort of struggling with too. There is clearly a shift in the US across the board with respect to the perception of China. But I think there are still considerable disagreements about what that means in terms of concrete policy responses. So the shift that has occurred is that China is no longer seen as a partner of some sort. It is very clearly seen as a competitor. That much, I think, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, there is consensus. But what specific policies one ought to adopt, even towards a competitor China, I think are still up for grabs. On the military side, for example, I don't think there is a big divide. Everyone knows we have to orient our military to great power competition, to deal with Chinese capabilities, and so on and so forth. On the political side, I don't think there is a big divide either. Everyone is suspicious either of the Chinese state or the Chinese regime. You can take your pick. And everyone agrees that we need to be much more tough-minded about pursuing our interests. On the economic side, that's where I see the biggest room for recalibration. I don't believe, if you have a Democratic administration in November, that you will have a continuation of the Trump administration's policies on the economic side. I think there will be an effort to adopt much more subtle policies, which will focus on protecting the crown jewels of American technology, American innovation, and so on and so forth, rather than a broad-gauged attack on interdependence and trade itself. I think that will be the shift that will likely occur. So that's a big question. But on the broad political question, right, the idea of a G2 is dead. I mean, no one is going to be thinking of G2s anymore. The US would have to be in really deep kimchi for us to glom on to a G2 idea. If anything, the G2, if it comes about, is going to be a G2 where we see the other partner in the dyad really as threatening to our interests, not a partner that you can collude with. So I think on that count, India has very little to fear. The question to my mind is whether India sees this moment as significant enough to move away from the dissembling that characterized its balancing of China to something more open. That's really the question. And I don't know where India will come out, but I hope for India's sake, it comes out in the direction of open balancing rather than covert balancing, which is what it has essentially done for the last 70 years.
Maybe over here also, I mean, on the triangular relationship between covert balancing, open balancing, and I guess the doubts on the Indian part, because at the end of the day, if you're going to make a pivot, you want assurances that your pivot is going to pay off in the long term, both on the economic and the political front. And perhaps this is exactly where think tanks like ours can play an important role in trying to find a bridge in the immediate to try and disabuse some of that distrust, but also to try and get a clearer sense of what a hedging strategy might be banked on. But just to finish, Ashley, do you have any questions for Ambassador Bambalwale?
Well, I have one actually, which has been troubling me for years actually now. And that has to do with, Gautam, your reading of the Chinese reticence to sort of work on the delimiting of the LAC. They've committed to doing this. There was a process where they committed to the exchange of maps and all that stuff. The simple fact of identifying what each side's perception on the ground about the LAC is does not subvert their claims to territory. So why is it that the Chinese have become shy in the last 15 years or so about following through on a commitment that they have not only made, but actually articulated on several occasions with India?
An excellent question, a difficult question. Not only, and they've also committed to clarify and confirm the LAC in a bilateral agreement or in a couple of bilateral agreements. So, this whole process of LAC clarification had a good start in the middle sector, but then, as you know, it broke down when we exchanged maps in the western sector. From what I am told and what I have heard and read, it's because they realized that there were large differences. But then there are bound to be large differences because that's the whole process of trying to clarify and confirm the LAC or even resolve and get a common boundary line. So I really don't have a final answer to your question, Ashley. But let me say that, everything that they've done on the ground over the past few years, but definitely in this summer, shows that they want to unilaterally clarify the LAC and decide the LAC, which is absolutely not acceptable to India. And we have conveyed it to them in these terms. So I'm quite surprised at what they tried to do on the ground this summer. And I believe I go back to the point that I've made, that they've lost India strategically for some what they thought would be a tactical game.
How they've lost India exactly strategically, I guess we will find out down the line. And I guess we'll have many other webinars to discuss these issues in many more details in the areas of technology, economics, multilateralism, and the nature of the bilateral relationship in the future. But for now, Ambassador Gautam Bambalwale, actually tell us, thank you so very much for spending the time for what is the most special webinar that I have hosted so far. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Rudy. It's a pleasure. It's great to see Gautam. I hope all of you are well, all our listeners too. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to our special audience, to your excellencies for attending the webinar, and for everybody else, please stay tuned with India and the World. Thank you.